Yes, a very good morning to you. It's Tuesday, the 6th of October, 2020. Welcome back to the best on-ground weekday kickoff. Along the eastern seaboard, it was a public holiday yesterday, so no show, but we're up, raring to go this morning, and plenty happening in the world of sport. We've scoured the newspapers, we've looked online, we've dissected what are the big sports stories, what's the news making waves this morning, and we're going to dissect that for you. And I'm joined, as always, by one of Australia's preeminent journos, and today I'm joined by the original co-host of the Best on Ground Weekday Kickoff, Christy Doran, down in Sydney. How are you, mate?
Well, good, Pete. I'm quite surprised that you took yesterday off, to be frankly honest. Journos don't sleep, you know that.
Well, mate, having a look at your Instagram stories over the last couple of days, you certainly don't sleep. I'll tell you that for free. But, mate, fantastic to have you back on the show and plenty to discuss this week. And, of course, it's Bledisloe Cup week in Rugby Union, and that's where you work at rugby.com.au, and we're going to start with one of your stories. And it's a great yarn looking at 5 Wallabies selection headaches for Sunday's first Bledisloe match in Wellington. Of course, the first match of new Wallabies head coach Dave Rennie's tenure, which always means when you've got a new coach, you don't have a lot to go by in terms of previous selection history. And it'll be fascinating to see how many Wallaby incumbents from the Michael Cheika era retain their places. I've no doubt we'll see a surprise when you look at a 44-player squad. It's extremely likely we're going to see 1 or 2 players picked in that 23 who none of us particularly thought were going to be heading down that direction. But you've broken down 5 of the big battles at the selection table, and I want to talk through a few of those. Firstly, you talk about the halves. Fly half, will it be Noah Lolesio, the rookie, Matt Tamua, or James O'Connor? And also at halfback, will it be the experienced Nick White or the debutant in Tate McDermott? Who would you be picking in the 9 and 10 jerseys, Christy?
It's one of those ones that there's so much intrigue about. Do you back youth in this situation? Because if you're really just thinking these guys have got something about them, let's roll the dice a little bit. Not a bad year to roll the dice too, because no one's really even expected Test match rugby to get up and running. So in that philosophy, you might go Noah Lolesio, Tate McDermott. I think if you were to gamble between either of them, you'd be going Tate McDermott at halfback. I still think he's a good, strong option. He's going to provide plenty of threats. And if you're doing that, I think you're doing James O'Connor at 10 as well. The two of them have been playing alongside one another now for a long time at the Reds this year. The combination set in stone. I think it's a good one. A solid conservative option, though, would be Nick White, Matt Tamua, and perhaps even Nero Simoni at the inside centre, given there's a bit of a Brumbies link in the halves and would know them each other very well too.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I'm with you. I think McDermott O'Connor is a really exciting 9-10. I don't mind throwing a rookie 9 into the mix. Nick White didn't play heaps of footy at the Brumbies since he returned from the UK. Noah Lolesio, I think he's got all the tools in his arsenal to be a long-term 10 for the Wallabies. But let's remember as well, his Super Rugby final was the first match he'd played in quite some time as well. So he might be lacking a little bit of match fitness and could be a good option to make his debut off the bench. What about a blindside flanker, Christy? You've thrown up 3 contenders there: Rob Ballatini, Pete Samu, or Ned Hannigan, all capped by the Wallabies already. And tell me who you're assuming is playing 7 and 8 to complement that back row.
Yeah, Rob Ballatini, I've thought for quite a while, could be at 6. Big ball carrier, will get over the advantage line. This Wallabies side, when you've got a bit of a lighter second row, you really need a little bit of starch and some power, and that's why I think Rob Ballatini could be a good option at 6. He's only got 1 test to his name, but fortunately you've got a bloke who's going to bring up his 100th, Michael Hooper, at open-side flanker. Given that he's captain, he's a shoo-in. He's a lay-down misère. He's there. There'll be people that continue to go, why isn't he going Liam Wright, Fraser McWright? You'll see one of those two on the bench, I would think. Perhaps Pete Samu off the bench, and I'd be going Harry Wilson at number 8. I think he gets over the advantage line, another really strong ball runner. You need those guys, I think. And Pete Samu's quality, I think he can play a role off the bench by covering any of those back row positions.
It's funny, you talk about Pete Samu covering multiple positions off the bench. And the final conversation we'll have will be around the back 3 and Reece Hodge, and player in a similar vein with that utility value. But just quickly on Samu, he's a winner. He makes every post a winner. He's won at the Crusaders. He's won at the Brumbies. He knows a lot of these All Blacks players really well and has played alongside them at the Crusaders. So for me, I'm starting him every day of the week. I think he was, a really bewildering non-selection for last year's Rugby World Cup, and I think he's got the runs on the board to start. But I don't mind the idea of having a Rob Valentini coming off the bench, kind of at the 60-minute mark, and the fact that he could come on for either a Samoa or a Harry Wilson, and you could carry a genuine 7 in McRide on the bench is pretty interesting for mine. We look to the fullback and the right wing as well. Just really quickly here, because we know Marika Koroibete would be on the left wing, and one of the challenges here is the Jordan Patea puzzle. Will he play 13 or 14? Because he's got to be a lay-down misère to start. But for mine, Reece Hodge, some people say he's the perfect Wallaby 23 because he can cover anywhere from 10 through 15 at a pinch. He can come on, he can kick goals. But for mine, he's got to start on the right wing. And that's no disrespect to Filippo Daugunu or Tom Wright, who I think are really exciting players. Tom Wright certainly makes my match day 23. But I've got Reece Hodge on the right wing, Patea at 13. And then I've probably got Tom Banks at fullback. A little bit of X factor. We know he's got a good boot on him. He's got the speed. And he's started to find a bit more of the form that we know he possesses towards the back end of the season for the Brumbies. Who have you got at 13, 14, 15, Christy?
I don't think they'll do this, but I'd be going Hunter Paisami at 13 and Patea at 14. I think if you're sticking with, and what I've said already, with the Reds halves, I think from a combination perspective, given they haven't been around for a long time, training together, there's been quarantines to contend with, that combinations are really important at this stage of the game. And I would be going Dane Haylett-Petty at fullback, but I can understand that. I think Patea, they probably want him closer to the ball. So in that respect, you might have him at outside centre. And then Reece Hodge, I'd be happy with on the right wing. As you've mentioned, he's a bloke who's played there a lot. There's still people questioning whether or not he's quick enough. But we've seen over the years that Reece Hodge has no issue getting to the try line. Finishes off tries really well. And that's something that the likes of Tom Banks and Haylett-Petty haven't been able to do on the right wing. They're not wingers, they're fullbacks, and you'd have to have either Haylett-Petty or Banks at fullback. You can't play them outside there.
Are we both looking at a 6-2 split on the bench?
I would go 5-3. I think just for the sakes of balance at this stage is pretty important. A couple of them haven't played a lot of rugby. Even guys like Haylett-Petty and Matt Moore, they've had little injuries, little tweaks along the road. So you might actually have to carry that third back at this stage, if indeed you're going to go Haylett-Petty at fullback.
Our second story today stays in rugby union. It's a fantastic yarn from Wayne Smith in the Australian. He's got some quotes from Rugby Australia chairman Hamish McLennan, as well as Pacific Rugby Players CEO Aidan Clark, and finally New South Wales Rugby Union chairman Roger Davis, all looking at 2021. And we know New Zealand announced last week they will run their Super Rugby Aotearoa competition again next year with the 5 teams. The only change they will make there is introduce a finals series. But Hamish McLennan suggested that there's no reason why a Trans-Tasman Super Rugby competition can't be up and running in 2021. We know quarantine restrictions are beginning to lift, and that Trans-Tasman bubble could be back to relative normality by as soon as Christmas. McLennan saying that Australia would be more than happy to host all the New Zealand Super Rugby teams. He's also said that Australia would be happy to play host to a Pacifica Super Rugby team, perhaps based out of Western Sydney. A lot of disappointment in New Zealand that a proposed Pacifica Super Rugby team is not going to be included. If they were to go it alone there in 2021, and Pacific Rugby Players CEO Aidan Clark really disappointed that New Zealand didn't take up the opportunity, to include that team in their competition. A couple of quotes here from Aidan Clark. Australia have had a far more open door policy and willingness with Pacific Island teams over the past few years compared to New Zealand Rugby. We've had the Fijian Drua play in the NRC. We've had various options where Australia have been a little bit more kind, but without wanting to say it, a little bit less arrogant about it. And then, of course, New South Wales Rugby Union Chair Roger Davis, he's a little bit concerned that a Pacifica team based in Western Sydney may cannibalise his supporter base. But I think the reality is he wants to know what competition is going to be going ahead so that he can plan accordingly. Do you think that Australia's doing the right thing, offering to bring the New Zealand teams here and to have a Pacifica team in 2021? Or do you think really we just need to get a season away similar to what we saw this year, Christy?
Well, the most encouraging thing that we heard out of Brett Impey's interview last week, and a few people were surprised that he called that at that late stage. There was a couple of rumours circulating that he might be actually throwing the hat out and potentially bowing out after a long stint in the game. But anyway, he confirmed that a Trans-Tasman competition at the end of the regular seasons for the Super Rugby Aotearoa, as well as the AU competition, they were looking to get that off the ground. And that's probably the most likely scenario. It's the most probably encouraging scenario that we can hope for in this case, given that Jacinda Ardern's been pretty strong with quarantine rules and regulations in the last 6 to 9 months. So I can't see a Trans-Tasman permanent competition coming into effect at the beginning of next year, but I think post seasons, the respective seasons will occur. As for a Pacifica side, I think it's an absolute must. We know that Australia are looking for, at the very least, six teams, because then you can play 3 matches a weekend, which is gold. I think two matches a weekend with the 5th side having a bye probably just isn't quite enough to get everyone excited, a little bit of variance in how the team's playing. So, and as for Roger Davis's comments around the cannibalisation, I think actually having 2 New South Wales sides, or sides based in New South Wales, would be brilliant for the game. It would probably strengthen the Waratahs. There would be perhaps a little bit of a derby sort of effect. And we know that the Pacific Island community is a big one, and they will only continue to bring their friends and family at the games. We've seen that over the years.
Yeah, for what it's worth, again, I'm applauding Rugby Australia, Hamish McLennan, for having vision, having ambition, and wanting to make things happen. We saw the Warriors play in a hub environment in the NRL this year for the whole season. We know a lot of these Pacific countries are some of the 9 countries in the world who haven't had a single COVID case. Samoa are amongst them. So interesting to see what transpires there. We have spent a little bit longer than usual on our first 2 stories, but when you have a rugby aficionado like Christy in the house, it's important to play to the strengths. That being said, we're going to move now to the AFL, and a great yarn from Jake Niall in The Age, looking at Chris Scott, coach of the Geelong Football Club. Of course, they lost their first final to Port Adelaide this week, which means that despite finishing top 4, they move into a make-or-break match with Collingwood this coming Saturday. And Chris Scott, it's an interesting one. He's been in that position for 10 years now. He won a premiership in his first year in 2011, and he's got the greatest winning record of any coach in AFL, VFL history, which is an astonishing achievement in a competition with both a draft and a salary cap, that he's got a winning percentage around that 70% mark. He's really highly rated internally within the Geelong Footy Club and within the industry. But Geelong fans, they're not so sold on a man who's only been able to deliver 1 premiership despite that record. What do you think, Christy? Are Geelong fans within their rights to question his tenure as coach if they were to be knocked out this week in the finals?
Yeah, you're ultimately judged on how many premierships you can get, how many flags you can get. So, yeah, they're definitely within their right, particularly if the Cats can't win one in the next 3 to 5 years, I would think. And maybe Chris Scott will be there for that period. And if he is, then you absolutely could question it. 70% is a huge winning percentage. We saw with Jake Niall there, was astute to point out, let's have a look at how Hawthorn are going, and let's look at how the Swans are going. Both those sides have struggled very much in 2020, and their lists have experienced similar sort of effects, somewhat ageing, a rebuilding going on. How does that take place? Can you continue to win? Do you do a mass overhaul? Chris Scott, having been such an integral part of that Brisbane Lions side of the early 2000s, winning 3 flags. Obviously, Brisbane made the 4th one, couldn't quite do it. He will know very well that you can't just you don't want to have a complete rebuild, but then again you don't get the drafts, you don't get the trades by finishing towards the top. But we know that the Cats are going to get a couple of draft picks, round 1 draft picks, which will be pretty important at the end of 2020.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point to look at Hawthorn and look at Sydney. And at the end of the day, I mean, as a fan of a football club that doesn't play a lot of finals myself, I think Geelong fans should be pretty pleased that their team is competing every year. That being said, they've had some generational players coming through that club, and only one premiership to show for it would be a bit of a shame as the likes of Joel Selwood, Gary Ablett, Harry Taylor move towards the end of their careers. Our penultimate story today comes from Sammy Phillips in the Sydney Morning Herald, and he's looking at the fact that the world's biggest men's tennis stars are facing a real quandary ahead of the Australian summer. Do they spend Christmas in quarantine, or do they miss the ATP Cup? The ATP Cup was started for the first time last summer, and it was a huge success. The tournament was played in Sydney, Brisbane and Perth during the group stage before moving to Sydney for a frenetic week of finals. Most of the big-name players in the world played. We know that Tennis Australia head Craig Tiley is looking to have 25 to 50% of fans at the Australian Open in January. Players are going to come in and be able to train, hopefully, during their quarantine. And there's possibly even the opportunity for them to play in some limited tournaments in the lead-up during their quarantine period as well. That being said, do players want to spend Christmas possibly without their families in a quarantine bubble in a hotel? Is that the way that they want to finish what's been a really, really tough year? Is the summer of tennis a great opportunity to get the best in the game playing here for 4 to 6 weeks, Christy, or is it going to end up in the too hard basket and we just need to worry about getting the Oz Open away?
I have a suspicion, taking the pessimistic view, that it might not end up with that Christmas bonanza of what you want. We know how successful it was earlier in the year, at the end of last year. It was great fun. Having worked at Fox, there was a lot of buzz at the time around the tennis. And we know that Channel 9 have been doing a good job there recently too. Nick Kyrgios, he came to life, reborn figure, and it was really that tournament, I think, that we actually started to see some of the best tennis, the best sportsmanship from Nick Kyrgios. It could end up in that hard basket. The reality is, at the moment, in Melbourne particularly, with COVID still around, still present, that the players aren't going to be able to, unfortunately, you wouldn't think, just be able to roam the streets like they generally are. And that's one of the really big appealing factors about these big tournaments, but particularly the Oz Open, with the weather being outstanding, and whether or not the state governments want players flying in, flying out of various cities on a whim. I think that could be a bit in the hard basket, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're so used to, Stefanos Tsitsipas going and getting a late night souvlaki in Melbourne's Greek community, and Serena Williams being seen up and down Chapel Street and the like. But certainly don't think that will be happening in 2021. Hopefully we do get to see a full summer of tennis. Our final story really quickly today also comes from the SMH from Michael Chammas and Adam Pengilly, and it looks at Blake Ferguson from the Parramatta Eels and the crucial fitness test he will face ahead of the match against the Rabbitohs this week, an elimination final there on Saturday night. We already know that Devo's season is over on one wing. He's picked up an MCL injury. So there's a very real chance the Eels will have 2 new wingers when they come up against the Rabbitohs. Rabbitohs are white hot. They had a big win over the Knights after a slow start. That's on the back of a shellacking of the Roosters the week before. As for the Eels, it feels like they've limped through to secure a top 4 finish. They were brave against the Storm, but never looked like winning. Are either of these teams capable of having a major impact on the NRL Premiership, Christy?
I don't think so. I don't think the Eels are. Yeah, they look like they're slightly running out of gas. It was a cracking game, that one, with the Storm and the Eels. I don't know if they didn't look at like winning at one stage. I think they were very much in the fight. But when you lose the strike power of Sivo out wide, who I don't think the Eels have got the best out of in recent months, and Blake Ferguson potentially going to be ruled out as well, that just a lot of the class, the finishing ability would go out the window. As for Souths, they've still got a lot of background noise at the moment with what's happening with Sam Burgess, with the club, with players, with coaches with doctors being spoken about. That you'll be always able to get up for a finals match, but and they've got a very experienced coach in Wayne Bennett. But that's a really big story that's just going to be surrounding them every day. Fortunately, they are in those bubbles, so that they're not necessarily going to be running into punters every second street asking them about these sorts of things, which, yeah, it is not a bad result for them. But if you look at the sides like the Panthers, like the Storm, they've got consistency right throughout, not just their list, but how they're playing. Cleary's doing wonders at the Panthers at the moment, running hot. They're what, 16 wins straight now. I think the Roosters, they got absolutely smashed just a couple of weeks ago, but they've got some champions in that side. They're premiership winners. You would think that the Panthers, the Storm, and the Roosters are the three ones that you'd be looking out for.
That being said, at least one of the Eels and Rabbitohs will be in that Final Four conversation. You do have to be in it to win it. Massive week of sport coming up. Fantastic to have Christy Doran back on the show. Make sure you catch all of his handiwork at rugby.com.au in the coming days. I dare say he will have plenty of great content for us. Thanks for being back on the show, Christy. Really appreciate it, mate.
Good to join.
That's the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff that you've been watching and listening. Have a fantastic day, and we'll see you again same time tomorrow. Cheers.